When I was doing my fieldwork in China between 2007 and 2009, I attended many queer public events, including gay weddings and queer film festivals and queer film screenings and LGBT prides in different Chinese cities, etc. I was really lucky in that I didn't realize that this would soon change, actually, especially after the 2008 Olympics, with a strengthened government control over NGO activities, etc. But I would also actually expand this time frame actually to a longer period of time. I would say starting from 2001 with China's entry into the WTO and with the pathologization of homosexuality in Chinese mental classification and mental disorders, etc. I think 2001 was an important time, although we know that actually periodization is always a problem. But with China's prospect of joining the WTO, there was a sense of optimism and openness in Chinese society, also with regard to Chinese government's attitudes. Nobody knows what's going to happen. Nobody knows what joining WTO might mean for sexual minority. People know that the society would be more open. Probably that would include openness of gender and sexual diversities, etc. So in 2001, homosexuality was deleted from the classification of mental disorders. And in the same year, the China's state television actually had a special program interviewing people such as Li Yinghe and Cui Ziren. That was actually the first media the open public come out of gay celebrities actually in Chinese media. And after that, actually, there has been a lot of LGBT individuals, events, and organizations mushrooming in Chinese cities. And of course, there is also an important background. Since then, Chinese government recognized actually the existence of HIV/AIDS in China, and it actually accepted the donation or the help of international foundations with regard to HIV/AIDS prevention. For example, a lot of important international foundations such as the Global Fund, the Ford Foundation, Bill Gates and Melinda Foundation, etc. They invested huge sum of money actually on China in the hope of stopping or solving the HIV problem. Well, in recognizing the HIV problem, the government also has to recognize actually the gay community in that it is one of the major target groups actually in China. So with the help of international foundations and with the open recognition of Chinese government represented by CDC, China Disease Control, Center for Disease Control, so a lot of LGBT NGOs or organizations have been set up actually to help HIV/AIDS prevention. However, the role of these NGOs is not confined to HIV/AIDS prevention. Of course, actually, they also commit themselves to gay rights, community culture, etc. And as a result, actually, all over the country, hundreds of LGBT NGOs were set up. Almost every city has at least one LGBT NGO that facilitated LGBT activism greatly. But meanwhile, there are also downsides because in official discourse, you can only talk about HIV/AIDS, gay identity in relation to HIV/AIDS. As a result, a particular type of gay identity, which is officially called MSM, men who have sex with men, were created, and people actually in the public discourse, a lot of people would equate gay identity with HIV/AIDS. That was a downside. And furthermore, different organizations in the community actually, there is a differentiation of community interests. Some NGOs become HIV/AIDS dedicated NGOs, and other NGOs actually devote more attention to community culture and rights advocacy, etc. And it was in this critical historical juncture that different types of identities, such as gay identity, lesbian identity, transgender identity, sex workers, etc. So there has been a proliferation of sexual identities or gender and sexual identities in China's gay community. And that was a critical historical moment in that we not only see actually the construction of a particular type of gay identity, we also see a multiplicity of sexual and gender identities, and furthermore, the formation of a queer politics versus gay identity politics in the Chinese context. And in 2008, with Beijing successfully holding the Olympics, it seems that China is successfully showcasing its economic and cultural power. However, as far as political publicity or communication is concerned, it was a disaster. And Chinese government realizes that there might have been too much freedom of speech or political rights actually for NGOs, etc. And this was also actually intensified by the political struggles actually in Chinese government at the time. So we see a strengthening actually control over public speech, over mass mobilization, and over LGBT NGOs. So I would see the optimistic period would roughly be the first decade of the 21st century. And after the Olympics, we see a change, although it was a gradual change towards more control and less freedom in terms of expression. I pretty much went into the field without much training in doing ethnography, and my impression about ethnography was that a stranger goes into a strange community in a remote country or remote part of the world, and he or she actually tries to maintain a objective distance actually towards the subject or the culture or community he or she is studying. And that was in a way, actually, the traditional paradigm of anthropology. But things have been changing, actually, with more and more nativist, if you like, informants actually participating in the ethnographic process. When I entered the field, actually went to Beijing in 2007, I realized that I cannot actually be a completely objective observer, in that nobody actually treat me as an outsider or foreigner, etc. I'm Chinese, I grew up in China, I speak perfect Mandarin, and I've been living in Beijing for many years. I'm very familiar with Beijing's gay community, at least. And soon, actually, I got involved in a lot of community organizations, such as organizing queer film festivals, starting from translating film subtitles to writing articles for the film festival catalogs. Later, I organized the discussion panels for the film festivals and writing actually articles and comments actually about the festival and about the films that I seen. So in this case, actually, I have become an activist, active participant in the form of activism that I'm writing about. And later, I discovered that there are different politics actually in Chinese queer communities. For one thing, there was a division between gay identity politics and queer politics. And there was a discussion, very heated discussion actually in 2013 and 14 about whether queer theory as a Western theory would suit the Chinese context. I participated actively actually in the debate as a community member and as an academic. At that time, I realized that probably actually being an academic is not antithetic to being an activist, and I can practice academic activism. And it was a critical historical juncture. It seems to every people at that time that people who are concerned with where China's queer activism is going and how do we understand LGBT activism in China today. And it was time for people who are devoted to the idea to participate, and it was only natural. So thinking about that, it was a coincidence that I participated in queer activism. as an academic and as a member of the community. However, now I would see that as my most appropriate way to engage with a community and engage with a topic, in that I cannot possibly actually keep an objective distance actually towards the community that I'm already familiar with, that I identify with. I acknowledge that having critical distance is important, and I, for myself, as a critical scholar, actually, I engage with the community actually in a critical way and contribute actually to the discussions with my academic expertise in terms of theory, etc. But this critical distance and this insider perspective also helps me actually to make a greater contribution to the culture that I'm involved in. This is an interesting question. It was not until recently that I've started to think about the importance that performance art and theatricality played actually in feminist queer activism in China. If you ask me actually what is a so-called Chinese characteristics of feminist and queer activisms, etc., and it's really hard to give an answer, but I can give you lots of examples, and those examples actually may have something in common, and one of them is the incorporation of performance art. For example, Fan Popo's 2009 film, New Beijing, New Marriage, and that is actually based on a documentation of a same-sex wedding photo shoots actually in front of Tianmen Street. And it was a Valentine's Day, and a group of gay and lesbian activists actually rehearsed a wedding photo shooting session in that place, in the public place, surrounded by hundreds of people, including the policemen actually. And then they interviewed the audience about their impressions and their ideas about homosexuality and same-sex marriage. And people gave different and interesting responses, etc. And the video was made and it was circulated in community centers and online, etc., and created some impact. What is interesting is really this form of activism actually is not the form of activism that we're familiar with in the Western context. For example, gay pride, coming out, etc. It's not purely coming out because all the actors and actresses or the gay volunteers actually, they claim that they're actors and actresses that just performed on that day. And on the other hand, it's also important because it is a coming out of the gay community to the public, and in such an important place such as Tianmen in the heart of Beijing. So that actually raises a question of why did they take this form of activism as a form of engagement with the public? And as I mentioned, that public protest and demonstrations and pride parades are impossible. So they had to think about some strategic and interesting ways, actually, to make their voices heard. And one of them is to incorporate performance art in queer activism and feminist activism. So on the one hand, that actually protected the people, the activists, in that they can just claim to people that we are just performing some kind of show and there's nothing genuine, there's nothing real, there's nothing political about it. And there has been a consensus about the separation between art and politics. So by using art to do queer politics and feminist politics is really a good way. But on the other hand, I think Ai Xiaoming, a professor from Guangzhou University in Guangzhou, also actually commented that this actually provided a safe space for gays and lesbians to come out to the public. In real life, it's very difficult for them, but with the disguise or in the disguise of doing a theater show, such as performing vagina monologue, different versions of vagina monologues in Chinese stages, that gives Chinese women and feminists a chance to voice their own opinions that do not sound overtly political and confrontational. I think that this is significant because gays and lesbians and activists in China are coming up with context-specific and culturally specific strategies actually to voice their opinions, to publicize knowledge about homosexuality, and to engage with the public without copying the Western model of coming out and pride parade.